My daughter chose her mother's side at the worst moment of my life. 5 years later she came back with the truth, and it was even worse than I had imagined. 5 years ago, my eldest daughter Allison, who was only 15 at the time, sat in a courtroom and looked a judge in the eyes as she claimed that I, her father, Stephen, then 45, had a history of aggression. She said it calmly, without tears, without hesitation, and those words, as thin and precise as knives, cut through everything I had tried to hold on to during the divorce. It didn't matter that I had never laid a hand on any of them, never raised my voice to the point of fear, never once given any real reason for concern. Her testimony became the linchpin in the court's decision, a single sentence that outweighed years of quiet, dedicated parenting. And just like that, my ex-wife Jessica, 2 years younger than me and far more ruthless than I had ever anticipated, was granted full custody of all 3 of our children. I remember the way she looked at me when the ruling was announced. Allison, not Jessica. She didn't smile or gloat. She just stared ahead, her face a blank mask, as if what she had done didn't hurt her in the slightest. I stood there in stunned silence, not even able to be angry because the pain was too deep for rage. I lost them that day, not just legally but spiritually. The court took my weekends, my holidays, my mornings of packing lunches and helping with homework. But Allison took something I hadn't expected, the core of who I thought I was as a father. And for years I didn't understand why. Jessica filed for divorce not long after I exposed her affair with Brian, a man I had once called my best friend, someone who had stood beside me at my wedding, who had held my newborn son in his arms and toasted to our future like it actually meant something. I had suspected for months, small changes in her behavior, odd absences, and the way she suddenly began defending him more than she defended me, but when the truth finally surfaced, it wasn't dramatic or tearful. It was cold, almost transactional. She packed a bag, said we were done, and within a week I was served the papers. At first I wanted to fight. I wanted to keep the house, protect what I had worked for, and draw the line where betrayal stopped taking things from me. But every time I looked at the kids, especially Allison, who was old enough to understand far too much and still not enough, I couldn't do it. I didn't want to drag them through the mud, didn't want courtrooms and affidavits and character assassinations to be part of their childhood. I thought, naively, that by staying calm and cooperative I was shielding them. Jessica saw things differently. To her, the children weren't just people we were raising together, they were leverage. Custody meant child support. It meant control. It meant a long-term financial stream that would keep her afloat while she rebuilt a life she had already started designing behind my back. I watched her shift in real time from wounded ex-wife to strategic opponent, and in the middle of all that calculation she saw Allison's voice, her testimony, as the ultimate weapon. And Allison, God help me, gave it to her. As Allison was a teenager at the time, her testimony carried significant weight in the courtroom, far more than I had anticipated, and certainly more than I was emotionally prepared for. She sat there, calm and composed, and told the judge that I was a threat to the children, that I had a temper, that my presence in their lives made them feel unsafe. She used clinical language, words that didn't sound like hers, words I recognized from Jessica's vocabulary, phrases like emotional instability and unpredictable behavior. And I could see the moment the court shifted. The judge leaned forward. The attorneys exchanged glances. And just like that, years of quiet parenting, of holding them through nightmares, of driving to recitals and soccer games and late-night ER visits, evaporated under the weight of a single statement from my daughter. The court believed her. Not because there was evidence, not because there had been any prior incident, but because Allison was old enough to sound reasonable, articulate enough to make it believable, and the court erred on the side of caution, as they often do when children say they're afraid. I was ordered to undergo mandatory therapy and parenting assessments, a humiliating process that felt more like proving I wasn't guilty of a crime I'd never committed than anything remotely therapeutic. It was months before I was granted limited supervised contact with my younger two, Jason, who was 13 at the time and quiet in ways that worried me, and Lily, just 11, still young enough to cry when she hugged me and ask when I was coming home. But even those brief visits felt like walking through a minefield, every word weighed, every movement scrutinized, the invisible question always hovering. Am I still their father, or just a ghost they're obligated to see? Allison completely stopped all contact with me after the trial, cutting me out of her life with the kind of cold finality that felt more like a punishment than a choice. She didn't reply to my messages, ignored my birthday cards, and never once showed up during the limited visitation days I had with her younger siblings. For a long time, I kept telling myself she would come around, that she was just a kid manipulated by her mother and caught up in a mess far too complex for a teenager to understand. But as the months dragged into years and the silence never broke, that hope slowly curdled into something heavier, something harder to admit. I began to feel betrayed by my own daughter. And not just betrayed but abandoned. Because it wasn't just the lie in court, it was everything that followed. The way she rewrote the story of who I was. The way she aligned herself fully with her mother, never questioning the fallout of what she had said. And no matter how much I tried to hold on to the idea that she was just a child doing what she was told, the hurt was still there, deep and sharp, and I couldn't pretend to forgive something that never came with an apology. I shifted my focus to Jason and Lily. They were the ones who ran to the door when I arrived, who clung to me like their arms hadn't forgotten who I was, who looked up at me with eyes that still held trust and love. They asked about our old routines, about pancakes on Saturdays and walks to the park, and in those moments I found enough to keep going. They were always happy to see me, always unfiltered in their joy, and even though the time we had was limited, it was real. They were the reason I didn't fall apart completely. They were the proof that some part of fatherhood hadn't been stolen from me entirely. In recent months, during the few hours I had with Jason and Lily, our conversation started to shift in tone. They began to share bits and pieces about what life was like back home, and more, those details painted a picture of growing tension between Allison and Jessica. They told me the house was full of arguments, that Allison and their mother were constantly clashing, sometimes shouting late into the night behind closed doors, other times avoiding each other completely for days. What struck me most wasn't just that they were fighting, it was how Jason described Allison when she came home. He said she looked different now. Not just older, not just tired from college, but genuinely defeated. Lily said she would walk into the house with her shoulders slumped, barely speaking, and go straight to her room without saying hello. She wasn't angry anymore, just quiet, like something inside her had been slowly drained. Jason told me she had started missing dinners, locking her door, spending more time on the porch than inside, like she was trying to breathe somewhere that didn't suffocate her. And it was strange, he said it like he was confused, like this wasn't the Allison he remembered. And deep down, I knew why it mattered so much. Because for the first time, my younger kids were seeing what I had seen years ago. Not just the manipulation, not just the control, but the cost. And Allison, now 20, away at college but still tethered to Jessica's expectations, was finally beginning to break under the weight of the very choices she once helped enforce. One quiet afternoon, under the kind of overcast sky that always seemed to settle heavily over that part of the neighborhood, I pulled up to Jessica and Brian's house to pick up Jason and Lily for our scheduled visit. I had done this dozens of times over the years, waited at the curb, exchanged polite, clipped words if necessary, and left quickly, never giving Jessica or anyone else more of me than I had to. But that day, as the front door opened and the kids came bounding out with their backpacks and wide smiles, I saw a figure behind them that made my breath catch for a split second. It was Allison. She stepped outside slowly, almost hesitantly, like someone crossing a line they weren't sure was safe. She didn't look like the teenager I had last seen in that courtroom, so composed and sure of herself. She looked older now, worn down, her face pale and serious, eyes that had seen things she wasn't ready to say. For a moment, we just stared at each other across the driveway, me behind the wheel, her standing at the edge of the lawn, and then, in a voice that was barely louder than the wind, she said, "Dad, can we talk?" It was the first time she had spoken to me in 5 years. I wanted to feel something monumental in that moment, relief, sadness, even curiosity, but all I felt was the cold weight of everything she had done and everything she had stayed silent about. I looked at her, really looked at her, and I replied flatly, "I'm not interested." There was no anger in my voice, just distance, like someone politely declining a conversation with a stranger. She blinked, stunned, and before she could say anything else, I turned to Jason and Lily, asked if they were buckled in, and drove away without looking back. Because forgiveness, I've learned, is something earned, not granted at the doorstep like a gift returned too late. She started calling first, quiet, hesitant calls that went straight to voicemail because I couldn't bring myself to answer. Then came the messages, one after another, not dramatic or pleading but careful, searching for some small crack in the wall I had built around myself. She wrote things like, "I know I don't deserve a response," and "I understand if you hate me," and though I deleted some of them without reading, others stayed in my inbox longer than I care to admit. After a few days, something inside me shifted. Not forgiveness, not even curiosity, just the sense that maybe it was time to look the pain in the face instead of avoiding it. So I agreed to meet. I told her she could come to the house, and I kept my expectations locked tight. When she arrived, it was nothing like the moment I had played in my head all these years. There was no confrontation, no explanations forced through gritted teeth. She stood on my front step with tears already in her eyes, hands trembling, her voice barely holding together as she said, "I'm sorry, Dad. I lied. I lied in court. Mom made me say those things. I didn't want to. I didn't even know what I was doing." And just like that, the truth landed between us. Not just the words but the weight of them, 5 years late and still so heavy. She admitted everything. That Jessica had coached her. That every word she said in court had been rehearsed, written down, drilled into her until it felt like her own. That she had done it because she didn't know how to say no. That she thought at the time it would make her mother happy, or at least stop yelling. I didn't say anything right away. I just watched her, this grown woman who had once been my little girl, sobbing on the porch of the home she helped take from me. And I realized then that the pain I carried wasn't mine alone. It had echoed in her all this time too. Jessica had lied to Allison for years, feeding her a carefully constructed version of our past that painted me as controlling, selfish, and cruel. She told her that I had forced her to drop out of medical school, that I never supported her ambitions, and that I only wanted her around to have children, treating her like nothing more than an incubator who existed to fulfill my needs and nothing else. Allison repeated those stories to me that night, each one landing like a blow, not because I hadn't heard Jessica twist the truth before, but because now I was hearing it from my daughter's mouth, believing it had been real her entire teenage life. But the truth was so far from that narrative it felt like a different lifetime. All of our pregnancies had been planned, each one a decision we had made together after long talks about timing, money, and the future we wanted to build. Jessica had once been passionate about medicine, yes, but it was her idea to pause her education, not mine, after Allison was born. We had agreed together that she'd return when the kids were older and things were more stable, and I had supported her every step of the way, even picking up extra shifts and shelving my own aspirations to make room for hers. But somewhere along the line she rewrote the story, first to justify her own bitterness, and later to manipulate Allison into believing I had stolen something from her mother. It was a devastating realization for Allison, one that unfolded slowly across her face as she started to see the cracks in the version of her childhood she had been given. She looked at me with shame and regret, and I could tell she was wondering how many other truths had been twisted, how much of her loyalty had been built on lies. And the hardest part was that I didn't even want to say, "I told you so." I just wanted her to finally see me, not the version Jessica had created, but the father who had been there all along, waiting for her to come back. After Allison's maternal grandmother was hospitalized, something shifted in her. Maybe it was the fear of losing another person she had once believed in, or maybe it was simply the weight of everything she'd learned finally pressing hard enough to make her seek clarity. She began visiting her grandmother more often, sitting by her bedside, staying longer each time, and during one of those visits she opened up in a way she never had before. She asked questions, honest ones, painful ones, and her grandmother, fragile but lucid, answered with something Allison hadn't expected: the truth. She told her the truth about me, about the marriage, about the divorce. She told her that Jessica had always resented me for things I never did, that she had twisted the story of our relationship long before it ever ended, and that the accusations Allison had believed for years were rooted not in reality, but in bitterness and control. She spoke plainly, not to protect me, not to villainize Jessica, but because Allison was finally asking as a woman, not a manipulated child. And that's what broke it. Not just the lies but the foundation they had been built on. Everything Allison had believed, about who I was, who her mother was, why our family had fallen apart, began to crumble under the weight of a truth she had never been allowed to hear. The trust she had given her mother, the loyalty she had held onto for so long, shattered not with anger but with heartbreak. She realized she hadn't just lied in court, she had lived a lie every day since. And it was that quiet collapse of certainty that finally forced her to face the full cost of what had been taken from both of us. Allison was furious when the full truth finally settled into her bones, not the loud, reactive kind of fury, but the deep, shaking anger of someone who realizes they've been used in the cruelest way possible. She told me, with tears rolling down her face and her hands clenched into fists, that she now saw it clearly, how her mother had manipulated her, twisted her into a weapon, and pointed her at me during the most vulnerable moment of our lives. She said she couldn't believe how easily she had been turned into a tool, not just to hurt me, but to erase me from their lives entirely. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was humiliation, grief, and rage all colliding at once. In the middle of her storm, she looked me dead in the eye and said I should sue Jessica. Not for revenge, not even really for justice, but because she believed Jessica needed to be held accountable for the years of emotional destruction she had orchestrated. She talked about emotional distress, psychological harm, about making sure someone finally saw what had been done to me, and, in a way, to all of us. But I shook my head. I told her no. I didn't say it because I wasn't angry or because I thought Jessica didn't deserve consequences. I said it because I had already lost too much in those battles, and I had spent too many years trying to piece myself back together to go charging into another war. I had no interest in courtrooms or testimonies or dragging the past through another legal circus. I just wanted peace. I wanted the few things I had reclaimed, my relationship with Jason and Lily, and now, maybe, a fragile beginning with Allison, to stay untouched by more destruction. And I saw the way Allison's expression changed when I said it, not disappointed but sad, because she finally understood just how deep the damage ran. I told her, as gently as I could while still holding my ground, that if she truly wanted to make things right, then she needed to focus on rebuilding real relationships, starting with me and extending to my brother and sister, the family she had been kept from and taught to ignore for years. But I also made it clear that I had no intention of being dragged back into the mud. I had spent too long pulling myself out of it, too many nights stitching together the dignity that had been torn apart by courtrooms, manipulation, and silence. I told her I wouldn't be a soldier in some new crusade, even if this time it came from a place of remorse instead of revenge. She wasn't prepared for the firmness in my voice. Allison had come expecting forgiveness, maybe even guidance, but not a boundary. Not from me. My tone wasn't cruel, but it was sharp enough to stop her in her tracks, and I could see the shock in her face as I said it. It was the first time I had spoken to her not as the daughter I was desperate to protect, but as an adult who had to take responsibility for her own choices, no matter how heavily they'd been shaped by someone else. She nodded slowly, said she understood, and left without another word. For a while after that, she disappeared again. No calls. No texts. No updates through Jason or Lily. Just silence. And though a part of me worried she might vanish for good, another part knew she needed time to sit with the weight of everything she had finally uncovered, not just what Jessica had done, but what she had allowed to happen in her name. A few days later, after sitting with the silence and feeling its weight grow heavier than my anger, I changed my mind and called her. The phone rang longer than I expected, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't pick up, but then her voice came through, quiet and unsure, like she hadn't dared hope I'd reach out. We talked, not cautiously or defensively but openly, like two people trying to find a place where the damage could breathe without poisoning what was left between us. She didn't hide behind justifications this time. She told me straight, she had lied in court because she wanted to save her mom. Those were her exact words. I thought I had to save her. She said Jessica was falling apart, crying all the time, talking about losing everything, about how I would take the house, take the kids, leave her with nothing. Allison, just 15 and desperate to keep the peace, did what she thought she had to do. She believed she was protecting the only parent she had left in her corner. But now she told me that choice haunted her. She admitted it hadn't just been a lie, it had been a wound she carried every day since, a secret she had tried to live with but could never escape from. I listened. I didn't interrupt. And when she was done, I told her something I hadn't been sure I would ever say, that I could forgive her. Not easily. Not all at once. But truly. Because she was a child then, and I knew the kind of fear and manipulation that can live inside a house like the one Jessica had built. But I also told her this, I couldn't forget. Not what was taken from me. Not how long I had been left in the dark. And she nodded and said, I don't want you to forget. I just want to make it right. And somehow, for the first time in 5 years, that felt like the beginning of something real. We agreed to work on our relationship, not with any grand declarations or timelines, but simply with the understanding that healing would take time and intention. For now, it's mostly video calls a few times a week, sometimes just 15 minutes after her classes, other times stretching into quiet, hour-long conversations where we talk about everything and nothing. There's still a carefulness to it, a mutual awareness that we're walking on ground that once gave way, but the words are sincere, and that's something I haven't felt from her in years. She doesn't try to rush the process or pretend the past can be erased. She asks about my life now, about Jason and Lily, about the things she missed while we were strangers. Sometimes she apologizes again in small ways without dragging it back into guilt, and sometimes she just listens. She's trying, not for show or to fix things all at once, but because she finally wants to know me, not the version she was told to fear but the man I always was. And as for me, I'm giving her a chance. Not because everything's been resolved and not because the hurt has vanished, but because I can see in her eyes that she's coming back with intention. And after everything we've both been through, the effort matters. She's no longer the girl who lied in court, and I'm no longer the father holding on to that single moment of betrayal. We're both older now, and if we're going to rebuild, it has to start from where we are, not where we were broken. And for the first time in a long time, I believe we can. I also reached out to Jessica, something I hadn't done directly in a long time, and asked her to reconsider the custody arrangements and to stop receiving child support. I was calm, direct, and careful with my words, but I made it clear that things had changed. I told her that I wasn't threatening her, I wasn't interested in dragging this through court again, but I did have a witness now. Someone whose testimony 5 years ago had torn everything apart, and who was now ready to tell the truth. She understood exactly what that meant, and for the first time in years I saw the control shift. There was no shouting, no pleading. Just a long silence on her end of the line before she finally said, "What do you want?" I told her what I wanted was simple: a fair agreement, shared custody, a financial reset, a chance to parent my children without being treated like a criminal. And in the end she agreed. Maybe because she knew she was cornered. Maybe because Allison's shift rattled her more than she let on. Or maybe, in some quiet corner of her conscience, she finally realized she had taken too much for too long. Whatever the reason, we signed a new agreement within weeks. The child support was dropped, the custody schedule was revised, and for the first time since the divorce, I felt like I had some kind of control over my own life again. Not out of revenge. Not to win. Just to breathe freely and be a father on equal ground. And after everything, that was enough. Now I spend more time with Jason and Lily, not just during scheduled visits, but in a way that feels natural again. Picking them up from school, helping with their homework, cooking dinner together on weekends, and watching them slowly stop measuring time by court orders and start measuring it in shared moments. There's a quiet kind of healing in their laughter, in the way they still reach for my hand when we cross the street, in the way they ask if I'm coming to their school play or soccer game and already know the answer is yes. I'm no longer a guest in their lives. I'm their dad again. And that means more to me than anything I thought I had lost. With Allison it's different, but no less important. We are slowly building a bridge between the two shores we've lived on for too long, each of us holding pieces of the wreckage, trying to turn them into something that can hold our weight. Our conversations are still careful, still marked with pauses where the past lingers too close, but there's honesty now, honesty that neither of us dared to bring to the surface before. Sometimes she calls just to tell me about her day, sometimes to ask about old memories she never trusted until now. Every time she reaches out, I remind myself that trust isn't built in one moment, it's built in thousands of small ones. And as I sit in the quiet after the kids have gone to bed, or when Allison sends a message that simply says, "Thinking about you today," I realize I'm learning how to be a father all over again. Not from scratch, but from truth, from loss, from love that refused to die, even when it was buried beneath silence and lies. And I hope, truly, that this time, everything will be right. Not perfect, not easy, but right.